He crashed on an alien world, but it wasn't the wreck that would kill him. It was her. Rin Blaze called her, reckless and alone, thought he'd escaped death, until an alien goddess with a deadly curve and an even deadlier secret pinned him to the wreckage. Clitheron's desert holds more than just a crash site. It's a battleground for power, and Rin's caught right in the middle of it. But what happens when the very thing that's supposed to kill him starts burning a path to his soul? Will he survive the hunt, or will the heat between him and the alien queen become the very thing that destroys them both? The clock's ticking, and the only way out might be to surrender to her. Hit subscribe now if you want to find out how this insane story ends. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment. The twin suns of Clitheron blazed overhead, their light splintering through a sky streaked with auroras of molten gold and violet. Below, the planet's surface shimmered, a sprawling desert of fractured glass dunes that caught every ray and threw it back in blinding prisms. Floating islands of magnetic quartz hung in the air, tethered by crackling arcs of electric blue energy that hummed like a chorus of angry bees. The air carried a sharp tang of metal and static, prickling the skin of anyone dumb enough to set foot here. Rin Blaze Calder was exactly that kind of dumb. Inside the cockpit of the Ember Talon, Rin gripped the controls, his scarred knuckles white as warning lights flashed red across the console. The sleek Interceptor, once a beauty of the solar vanguard, now a battered shadow of its glory days, groaned under the strain of evading 3 bounty hunter skiffs. Their plasma bolts streaked past, one grazing the hull with a screech that made Rin wince. "Ah, come on, baby," he muttered, patting the dashboard like it was a spooked horse. "Don't quit on me now. I've got a reputation to ruin." His gray eyes flicked to the rear-view screen. 3 ugly ships, all spikes and guns, gaining fast. He'd pissed off the wrong smuggler king on Rigel. 9, and apparently, the guy didn't take kindly to losing a shipment of illegal grav cores. Rin's lips curled into a crooked grin. "Should have paid me better." A sudden jolt rocked the ship as an engine sputtered, coughing black smoke into the void. "Oh, you got to be kidding me," Rin groaned, slamming a fist on the console. The Ember Talon lurched, its thrusters failing mid-dodge, and Clitheron's gravity yanked it down like a kid snatching a toy. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" he shouted to no one, yanking the stick as the planet's crystalline surface rushed up to meet him. The crash was a symphony of chaos. The Ember Talon slammed into a glass dune, carving a fiery trench through the brittle landscape. Shards exploded outward, glinting like a million tiny stars, and the ship skidded to a stop with a groan of twisting metal. Rin's head bounced off the seat, stars of his own dancing in his vision. He coughed, tasting blood, and fumbled for the canopy release. "Well," he rasped, kicking it open, "that's one way to park." He stumbled out into the blinding light, his flight jacket singed at the edges, flapping in the static-charged breeze. At 32, Rin was lean and tall, all sharp angles and restless energy, with a stubbled jaw that hadn't seen a razor in weeks. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it with a flick of his battered lighter, and took a long drag, exhaling smoke into the alien air. "Guess I'm grounded in style," he muttered, squinting at the wreckage. The Ember Talon looked like a bird that had flown into a window, sleek lines crumpled, but still proud in its ruin. A shadow fell over him, sharp and sudden. Rin froze mid-drag, his instincts, honed from years dodging plasma fire, screaming. He turned, and there she was, an alien woman straight out of a fever dream, perched atop a floating quartz shard like she owned the damn sky. Her skin gleamed pale and glossy, like starlight caught in a raindrop, and her body, holy hell, that body, was all killer curves poured into a dew-damp silk dress that hugged every inch. Narrow waist, wide hips, a full bust that strained the fabric. Rin's brain stalled, rebooting just in time to register the glowing indigo markings pulsing on her skin, the obsidian horns arcing back from her head, and the long, silver hair spilling down her back, pinned with a pink peony clip. Her tail, indigo and glowing, flicked with elegant menace, and her double-pupil amber eyes locked on him with a mix of disgust and smoldering intensity. She leapt down, landing with a grace that made the glass crunch beneath her bare feet, and before Rin could blink, she had him pinned against the Ember Talon's hull. Her tail coiled tight around his torso, squeezing just enough to make his ribs creak, and her claws dug into his jacket, pressing through to prick his chest. Her glossy skin brushed hot against him, the heat radiating through his flight suit, and Rin's pulse kicked into overdrive. Up close, she smelled like ozone and something sweet, dangerous as hell and twice as tempting. "Nice moves, princess," he managed, voice rough but steady. Dance card open. Her eyes narrowed, those twin pupils boring into him like lasers. "You're a fleeting pest, human," she hissed, her voice a melody laced with venom. "This is Clitheron. Your kind doesn't belong here." Rin tilted his head, cigarette dangling from his lips. "Name's Rin. Rin Calder. And I don't belong anywhere, sweetheart. That's my charm." He flashed a grin, the kind that had gotten him punched more times than he could count. Her tail tightened, and he grunted, feeling the pressure slide up his ribs. Okay, tough crowd." She released him with a shove, stepping back, but keeping her tail poised like a whip. "I am Zyrra Velethar," she said, her chin lifting with regal disdain. "Noble of the Clitheron ascendancy. You've trespassed on sacred ground." She gestured to the fractured dune where a jagged crystal pillar, once tall and glowing, now lay in pieces, its light flickering out. "That was an ether conduit. You've defiled it." Rin took another drag, eyeing the wreckage. "Oops. Send me the bill." He flicked the cigarette away, and it sparked against the glass, earning a glare from Zyrra that could have melted steel. Before he could dodge, she grabbed his arm, her claws digging in just shy of drawing blood, and yanked him forward. Her tail slid along his wrist, a possessive grip that sent a jolt through him, half thrill, half warning. "You'll answer to the council," she snapped, dragging him toward a shimmering horizon where a mirrored fortress floated on a quartz island, its edges catching the auroras like a beacon. Rin stumbled after her, boots crunching, trying not to stare at the way her dress clung to her hips with every step. "Council, huh? Sounds like a party. Do I get +1? Her tail flicked, smacking his leg with a sting that made him yelp. "Silence, pest," she said, but there was a flicker in her eyes. Annoyance, sure, but something else too. Curiosity, maybe. Rin filed that away, his pilot's instincts kicking in. Every weakness was a crack he could pry open. The citadel loomed closer, its walls reflecting the desert in a kaleidoscope of light. Zyrra hauled him up a ramp of polished quartz, her grip unrelenting, and Rin couldn't help but notice the heat of her touch through his sleeve, electric, alive, and way too distracting for a guy who'd just crashed his only ride. The massive doors swung open, revealing a chamber of mirrored walls and floating crystal orbs, each pulsing with a faint indigo glow. A dozen Clitherons turned to stare, tall, glossy-skinned figures in robes that shimmered like liquid metal, their eyes all double-pupiled and cold. At the center stood an older figure, his skin etched with silver veins, his horns longer and sharper than Zyrra's. "Elder Chiron," Zyrra said, bowing stiffly as she shoved Rin forward. "I bring the intruder." Chiron's gaze slid over Rin like he was a bug under a scope. "A human," he said, voice low and icy. "Loud, brief, and destructive. Explain this desecration, Zyrra." She straightened, her tail flicking behind her. He crashed into the expanse, shattering a conduit. "I apprehended him before he could flee." Rin raised a hand, flashing a grin. "In my defense, I was aiming for a soft landing. Gravity's a jerk." A ripple of murmurs ran through the council, none of them amused. Chiron's eyes narrowed, and Rin felt the temperature drop, figuratively, but also maybe literally, given the static chill prickling his skin. "This filth dares mock us," Chiron said, stepping closer. "The ether sustains our eternity. Your kind threatens it with your chaos." He turned to the council. "He dies at dawn." Zyrra's tail twitched, and she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the hum. "Wait. His resilience, it's unusual." He survived a crash that should have killed him. Her amber eyes flicked to Rin, lingering a beat too long. Perhaps he's worth studying first. Chiron's glare snapped to her. You'd spare this vermin? I'd understand it, she shot back, chin high. Rin caught the tension. Zyrra wasn't just defending him. She was pushing against something bigger. He didn't know what, but he'd take any lifeline. Fine. Chiron relented, his tone dripping with disdain. To the cells. But his fate is sealed. Guards, tall, emerald-skinned brutes with spears, grabbed Rin's arms, dragging him toward a side passage. He twisted, shooting Zyrra a wink as he went. Catch you later, Shiny. Her tail lashed the air, and she turned away, but not before Rin saw the faintest quirk of her lips. The guards hauled him down a corridor of polished quartz, the walls reflecting his battered reflection back at him. His mind raced, already plotting, because if there was one thing Rin Blaze Calder knew, it was how to turn a crash into a comeback. The corridor of polished quartz stretched endlessly ahead, its mirrored walls throwing Rin's battered reflection back at him in a dozen jagged angles. The Clitheron guards hauled him along, their emerald hands clamped tight around his arms, spear tips glinting inches from his ribs. His flight jacket flapped with each step, the singed edges brushing the cold stone floor, and his boots scuffed a rhythm that echoed off the crystalline surfaces. Rin's mind churned, half plotting escape, half replaying the way Zyrra's tail had coiled around him like a live wire. Focus, Blaze, he muttered under his breath. Get out, then flirt with the alien goddess. The guard shoved him into a cell, a small, hexagonal chamber with walls of translucent quartz that pulsed faintly with indigo light. The door slid shut with a hiss, sealing him in, and Rin stumbled forward, catching himself against the far wall. He turned, testing the space. No windows, no vents, just smooth, glowing stone and a single bench carved from the same material. 5-star accommodations, he said, flashing a grin at the guards through the door's narrow slit. Tell me the room service comes with a beer. One guard snarled, his double-pupil eyes narrowing, but they marched off without a word, their spears clanking against the floor. Rin exhaled, running a hand through his tousled black hair, and sank onto the bench. His cigarette was long gone, lost in the scuffle, and his lighter felt heavy in his pocket, a useless comfort now. He leaned back, the cold quartz biting through his jacket, and let his mind drift to the crash, to Clitheron's insane beauty, to Zyrra. Those amber eyes, that glossy skin. Hell, she was a walking paradox, all regal fury and dangerous curves. He smirked, shaking his head, and I thought smugglers were trouble. A soft hum broke his thoughts, the door sliding open with a whisper of air. Rin snapped upright, hand dropping to his hidden blade, a shard of metal he'd swiped from the Ember Talon's wreckage, tucked inside his sleeve. Zyrra stepped in, alone, her silhouette filling the frame like a vision carved from starlight. The wet silk dress clung to her hourglass figure, the dew-damp fabric catching the cell's glow and accentuating every dip and swell. Narrow waist, wide hips, a bust that made Rin's throat dry up. Her silver hair flowed loose, the peony clip glinting faintly, and her tail flicked behind her, indigo tip glowing with restless energy. Miss me already, Shiny? Rin said, leaning back with a cocky tilt, though his pulse kicked up a notch. She didn't answer, just strode forward, her bare feet silent on the quartz. The door hissed shut behind her, locking them in, and the air thickened with static, and something else, something electric that made his skin prickle. Zyrra stopped inches from him, close enough that he could feel the heat rolling off her glossy skin. You're a fool, she said, her voice low and cutting, laced with that melodic venom he was starting to crave. Your bravado won't save you from Chiron. Her amber eyes, those damn twin pupils, bore into him, smoldering with a mix of contempt and something hotter, something that made his gut tighten. Bravado's kept me alive this long, Rin shot back, holding her gaze. That, and a knack for pissing off the right people. He shifted, testing her, and she moved faster than he could blink. Her hand slammed against the wall beside his head, claws digging into the quartz with a sharp crack, and her tail lashed forward, coiling around his thigh with a grip that sent a jolt through him. Firm, possessive, and dangerously alive. Her body leaned in, her full bust pressing against his chest, the silk sliding slick and warm over his flight suit. Rin's breath hitched, every nerve lighting up as her curves molded to him, her heat seeping through the fabric like a slow burn. "You're a spark in a storm," she murmured, her lips hovering near his ear, her breath a crackle of static that raised the hairs on his neck. Bright, brief, and doomed to fade. Her claws slid down the wall, brushing his shoulder, and her tail tightened, pressing harder into his thigh, the glowing tip tracing a slow, deliberate arc that made his muscles tense and his mind scramble. The sensation was raw, intimate, overwhelming, like she was staking a claim he hadn't agreed to yet couldn't refuse. Rin swallowed, forcing a grin through the haze. "Want to bet on that, princess? I've outrun worse than your shiny counsel." His voice came out rougher than he meant, and he shifted, his hands itching to grab her hips, to feel that glossy skin under his palms. But he held back, barely, knowing one wrong move could end with those claws in his throat instead of his jacket. Zyrra's eyes flicked over him, lingering on his stubbled jaw, his scarred hands, the way his chest rose and fell under her weight. "Why trespass here?" she demanded, her tail sliding higher, pressing firm against his hip now, the pressure a maddening tease that made his blood roar. "What drives a creature like you to defy death so recklessly?" "Freedom," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop it, raw and unguarded. "Lost my squad to a bad call. My call. Been running ever since, chasing something I can't name." He met her gaze, letting her see the crack in his armor, the pilot who'd burned too bright and crashed too hard. "Guess I found it here, huh?" For a moment, her mask slipped. Those amber eyes softened, the smoldering intensity giving way to something deeper, something that mirrored his own ache. Her tail loosened, just a fraction, and her claws eased off the wall, brushing his arm as she pulled back. "You're a curiosity," she said, almost to herself, her voice quieter now. "A mortal who burns instead of fades." Flattered, Rin quipped, but the air between them hung heavy, charged with unspoken questions. Before he could push further, a sharp clang echoed down the corridor. Boots on quartz, voices rising. Zyrra's tail snapped free, whipping behind her as she straightened, regal disdain snapping back into place like a shield. "Guards," she said, turning toward the door. "Chiron's patience is thin." She paused, glancing back at him, her silhouette framed by the glowing quartz. "Don't die too quickly, human. I'd hate to waste my time." Rin smirked, leaning back as if he weren't sweating through his jacket. "No promises, Shani, but I'll save you a seat." The door slid open, and she stepped out, her hips swaying with every stride, leaving him alone with the echo of her touch and the faint hum of the cell's walls. He flexed his thigh where her tail had gripped him, the ghost of that pressure still tingling under his skin, and fished the shard from his sleeve. The guards' voices grew louder. Orders, footsteps, the clank of spears. Rin stood, rolling his shoulders, his grin sharpening into something feral. Chiron wanted him dead? Fine. But Rin Blaze Calder didn't go down without a fight, and he sure as hell wasn't letting some crystal council dictate his exit. The door hissed again, and two guards stormed in, spears leveled. Rin ducked the first thrust, slashing upward with his shard, the metal biting into emerald flesh. The guard howled, staggering back, and Rin spun, slamming his elbow into the second one's jaw. "Sorry, fellas," he grunted, kicking a spear aside as it clattered to the floor. "Got a date to keep." He bolted for the corridor, the quartz reflecting his shadow in a dozen frantic streaks, his boots pounding a rhythm that matched the wild thud of his heart. Behind him, shouts erupted, and the hum of the citadel's defenses kicked up, a low growl that vibrated through the stone. Rin didn't look back. He just ran, the taste of freedom and Zyrra's electric heat still burning on his tongue, driving him into the unknown. Rin blazed, Calder sprinted through the citadel's quartz corridors, his boots pounding a frantic beat against the polished stone. The walls threw his shadow back at him in fractured streaks, a dozen ghost Rins running alongside, each as battered as the real thing. Shouts echoed behind. Clitheron guards barking orders, their spears clanking as they gave chase. The air buzzed with static, the citadel's defenses humming to life, a low growl that vibrated through his bones. Rin's flight jacket flapped, singed edges trailing, and a shard of scavenged metal gleamed in his fist, still slick with emerald blood from the guard he'd slashed. "Gotta move, Blaze," he muttered, ducking under a low arch as a spear whizzed past, embedding itself in the wall with a sharp crack. He spun, grinning despite the burn in his legs. "Nice try, fellas. Aim's a little off." The guards roared, their double-pupil eyes glinting with fury, but Rin was already gone, rounding a corner into a wider hall. The ceiling soared above, studded with floating crystal orbs that pulsed indigo, casting eerie light over the mirrored floor. Ahead, a massive window loomed, floor-to-ceiling quartz, framing the fractured expanse beyond, a desert of glass dunes and jagged spires, shimmering under Clitheron's twin suns. He didn't slow. With a grunt, Rin hurled himself at the window, shoulder first. The quartz shattered outward in a glittering explosion, shards raining down like a storm of stars. He hit the ground outside rolling, glass crunching beneath him, and scrambled to his feet, the hot wind of the expanse whipping his hair. The citadel loomed behind, a floating fortress of mirrored menace, but Rin didn't look back. He bolted into the dunes, his boots sinking into the brittle surface, each step a gamble against slicing his legs to ribbons. The fractured expanse stretched endless before him. Dunes of fractured glass that caught the auroras overhead, gold and violet light dancing in the sky. Floating quartz islands drifted above, their electric blue tendrils snapping like lightning. Rin's chest heaved, sweat stinging the gash on his arm from the self-fight. But he kept moving, driven by the same reckless fire that had carried him through a dozen near-death runs. "Freedom's out there," he rasped, dodging a jagged spire that gleamed like a blade. "Just gotta find it." A shadow flickered ahead, sharp and swift. Rin skidded to a stop, shard raised, his gray eyes narrowing. "Who's there? Come get some." The air crackled, and Zyrra Velithar stepped from behind a crystalline outcrop, her glossy skin catching the sunlight like liquid starlight. That dew-damp silk dress clung to her killer curves. Narrow waist, wide hips, a full bust that strained the fabric with every breath, and her silver hair spilled wild, the peony clip glinting faintly. Her tail flicked, indigo tip glowing, and her amber eyes locked on him, twin pupils burning with a mix of irritation and something fiercer. "Found you," she said, her voice a low, melodic growl that sent a shiver down his spine. "You're louder than a dying star, human." Rin lowered the shard, flashing a crooked grin. "Miss me that bad, Shiny?" Couldn't stay away. He took a step closer, testing her, and she moved like a predator, closing the gap in a heartbeat. Her tail lashed out, coiling around his wrist with a snap, yanking him forward until he stumbled into her. Her claws dug into his chest, pinning him against a glass spire, the sharp edge biting into his back as her body pressed flush against his. The heat of her glossy skin seared through his flight suit, her curves molding to him, soft yet unyielding, a wall of silk and power that made his pulse hammer. "You're a walking hazard," she hissed, her lips inches from his, her breath a hot spark against his stubbled jaw. Her tail tightened, sliding up his arm, the glowing tip pressing firm into his biceps with a slow, deliberate grind that sent a jolt through him. Electric, raw, and dangerously alive. Her bust pushed harder against his chest, the silk slipping slick over his ribs, and Rin's hands twitched, itching to grip her hips, to feel that impossible heat under his palms. The sensation was a punch to the gut, intimate, overwhelming, like she was daring him to break. "Guilty as charged," he rasped, voice rough with strain, forcing a smirk through the haze. But you're the one playing chase, princess. He shifted, his knee brushing her thigh, and her tail twitched, the pressure easing just enough for him to catch his breath. Her eyes flicked over him, his torn jacket, the sweat on his brow, the flicker of defiance in his gaze. And for a split second, her mask slipped, revealing a flicker of reluctant intrigue. "You escaped," she said, her claws retracting slightly, brushing his collarbone with a tease of danger. "Chiron's guards are hunting you. Why run into the expanse?" "Better than a spear in the gut." Rin shot back, leaning in her grip, testing the edge of her control. "And maybe I wanted to see if you'd follow." Her tail slid free, whipping behind her, and she stepped back, leaving a cold void where her heat had been. Rin flexed his arm, the ghost of her touch still tingling, and straightened, brushing glass dust from his jacket. Zyrra's lips quirked, not quite a smile, but close. "You're a fool," Rin called her. "A brave one, perhaps, but a fool." She turned, gesturing to the horizon where the dunes rose into jagged peaks. "The ether vault lies that way. Chiron will send worse than guards if he finds you alive." "Worse, huh?" Rin fell in a step beside her, keeping pace despite the ache in his legs. "What's his deal? Guy acts like I spat in his soup." The glass crunched underfoot, and a floating island drifted low overhead, its electric tendrils snapping in the wind. Zyrra's tail flicked, brushing his calf, a fleeting touch that made him stumble, earning a sharp glance from her. "The ether crystals sustain us," she said, her voice tightening. "Our immortality depends on them. Your crash disrupted a conduit. Chiron fears your kind brings chaos that could unravel everything." She paused, her amber eyes distant. "He's not wrong to fear chaos, but he's blind to its potential." Rin caught the shift in her tone, the crack in her regal shell. "Potential, huh? You saying I'm growing on you, Shiny?" He flashed a grin, dodging a shard that jutted from the dune. She didn't answer, but her tail flicked again, a silent reprimand that grazed his thigh and left him smirking. They trekked deeper into the expanse, the twin suns sinking lower, painting the glass in hues of fire and shadow. Rin's boots slipped on a slope, and he caught himself, swearing under his breath. Zyrra moved ahead, her grace effortless, her dress catching the light in a way that made it hard to focus. He shook his head, forcing his mind back to survival. "So what's the plan? You dragging me to this vault to turn me in, or are we playing rebels together?" She stopped, turning to face him, her silhouette framed by a towering spire. "I haven't decided," she admitted, her voice softer now, laced with something raw. "You're a spark, human, dangerous, fleeting. I should end you myself." Her tail rose, hovering near his chest, but didn't strike. "Yet here I am." Rin stepped closer, close enough to feel her heat again, his grin fading into something real. "Guess we're both taking a gamble, then. I'm good at those." Her eyes held his, twin pupils searching, and for a moment, the expanse faded. The dunes, the danger, the hum of pursuit, just two sparks in a sea of glass, daring each other to burn brighter. A distant whine cut through the silence, sharp and mechanical. Zyrra's head snapped up, her tail lashing the air. "Reapers," she said, her voice hardening. "Chiron's drones. They're tracking you." She grabbed his arm, claws pricking his skin, and pulled him toward a cluster of spires. "Move now." Rin didn't argue, breaking into a run beside her, the glass crunching underfoot as the whine grew louder. Shadows darted across the dunes, sleek, skeletal machines with glowing red eyes, skimming the surface like predators on the hunt. His heart pounded, adrenaline surging, but he shot Zyrra a sidelong glance, catching the fire in her eyes. "Looks like date night's getting spicy," he quipped, ducking as a reaper's beam scorched the ground behind him. Zyrra's tail flicked, smacking his shoulder as they dove behind a spire, the glass trembling under the drone's assault. "Keep talking, human," she muttered, her body pressed close to his in the tight space, her heat a steady pulse against his side. "It'll make killing you easier." But her hand lingered on his arm, claws retracted, and Rin grinned, ready to face the storm with her, or die trying. The Reapers closed in, their beams slicing through the dunes, and Rin tightened his grip on the shard, his mind racing for a way out. The glass spire shuddered as a Reaper's beam carved a molten scar across its base, sending a spray of crystalline shards raining down. Rin blazed. Calder pressed himself tighter against the jagged surface, his flight jacket snagging on the edges, the sharp bite of glass a cold counterpoint to the heat of Zyrra Velithar's body beside him. Her glossy skin gleamed in the flickering light of the auroras overhead, her dew-damp silk dress clinging to her curves like a second skin. Narrow waist, wide hips, a bust that rose and fell with each sharp breath. Her tail flicked restlessly, brushing his leg, and her amber eyes, those twin pupils burning, scanned the dunes for the drone's next move. "Stay low," she hissed, her voice a melodic snarl that cut through the whine of the Reaper's engines. Her shoulder pressed into his, her heat seeping through his suit, and Rin's pulse kicked up, a wild rhythm that matched the chaos around them. 3 of the skeletal machines skimmed the glass, their red eyes glowing like embers, beams slicing through the expanse with surgical precision. Chiron's hunters weren't playing. This was a kill order, and Rin was the prize. "Low's my middle name," he quipped, ducking as another beam scorched the air above, the heat singeing his hair. He flashed Zyrra a grin, shard still clutched in his fist. "Well, technically it's danger, but you get the gist." Her tail smacked his thigh, a sharp sting that made him grunt, but her lips twitched, almost a smile buried under layers of irritation. "Fool," she muttered, shifting closer, her body a taut line against his in the cramped space. "They'll shred us if we don't move." Her claws grazed his arm, a fleeting warning, and Rin nodded, his gray eyes flicking to the horizon. The dunes stretched endless, a glittering maze of glass and shadow, but a cluster of towering spires loomed ahead. Cover, maybe, if they could make it. "On 3, he said, counting down with a whisper. 1, 2. He didn't wait for 3, bolting from the spire with Zyrra on his heels, her grace outpacing his stumble. A Reaper pivoted, its beams slashing the ground where they'd been, vitrifying the glass into a smoking mirror. Rin dove behind the next spire, rolling to a stop, and Zyrra landed beside him, her tail coiling briefly around his ankle to steady him before snapping free. "Nice hustle, Shiny," he panted, brushing glass dust from his jacket. "We might just—" His words died as a shadow loomed overhead, a Reaper dropping low, its claw-like arms extending with a metallic screech. Rin lunged, tackling Zyrra out of its path, and they hit the dune hard, tumbling down the slope in a tangle of limbs. His arms wrapped around her, hands digging into her hips as they rolled, her glossy curves pressing tight against his chest, silk sliding slick and warm over his skin. The impact jolted through him, but it was her heat, electric, unyielding, that made his breath catch, a raw surge that lit every nerve. They landed in a shallow trench, Rin on his back, Zyrra sprawled atop him, her silver hair spilling over his face like a curtain. Her tail lashed, curling around his thigh with a possessive grip, the glowing tip pressing firm into his muscle with a slow, grinding pressure that sent a shockwave up his spine. Her claws dug into his shoulders, pinning him down, and her full bust crushed against his chest, the silk straining as she shifted, her weight a maddening tease that made his blood roar. Her amber eyes locked on his, twin pupils dilated, smoldering with fury and something hotter, something that made the air between them crackle. "You idiot," she growled, her lips hovering inches from his, her breath a hot spark that grazed his stubbled jaw. "You could have died." Her tail tightened, sliding higher, the pressure a deliberate pulse that made his hips twitch involuntarily, and Rin's hands flexed, fingers sinking deeper into her hips, feeling the taut curve beneath the silk, a lifeline in the chaos. "Worth it," he rasped, voice rough with strain, forcing a grin through the haze. "Got you on top, didn't I?" Her claws pricked his skin, a sharp sting that danced on the edge of pain and thrill, and her tail eased off, brushing his thigh with a teasing flick as she pushed herself up. The loss of her weight left him cold, but the ghost of her touch lingered, a fire under his skin he couldn't shake. "Move," she snapped, rising with a grace that belied the tension in her frame, her dress clinging tighter as she brushed glass from her arms. Rin scrambled up, shard in hand, and followed her lead, the Reaper's whine growing louder as they regrouped. They darted through the spires, weaving a jagged path, beams scorching the ground behind them in bursts of molten light. The air thickened as they ran, the twin suns dipping lower, painting the expanse in hues of fire and shadow. Rin's lungs burned, his legs aching from the uneven glass, but Zyrra pressed on, her tail flicking like a metronome, guiding him forward. "How many of these tin cans does Charon have?" He panted, dodging a shard that jutted from the dune like a spear. "Too many," she replied, her voice tight. "They're ether reapers, drones built to harvest life force. Chiron's desperate to stabilize the crystals." She glanced back, her amber eyes catching his, and Rin saw the flicker of something raw. Fear, maybe, or defiance. "They want yours." Flattering, he quipped, but his gut twisted. He'd faced death before, too many times, but this was different. These weren't bounty hunters he could outfly. These were machines tied to something bigger, something Zyrra cared about despite her icy front. "Guess I'm special." She didn't respond, just grabbed his wrist, pulling him toward a narrow crevice between two spires. They squeezed through, the glass scraping his jacket, and emerged into a shallow hollow, a pocket of calm amidst the storm. The Reaper's whine faded, circling wider, and Zyrra leaned against a spire, her chest heaving, her glossy skin dulled by dust, but no less striking. Rin sank beside her, catching his breath, the shard clattering to the ground as he flexed his cramped hand. "Why'd you come after me?" he asked, his voice quieter now, cutting through the hum of the expanse. "Could have let them skewer me back there." Zyrra's tail flicked, brushing his boot, and she turned her head, amber eyes meeting his. "You're a spark," she said, echoing her words from the cell, but softer this time, laced with something unguarded. "Chaos, yes, but alive. My kind, we've forgotten what that feels like." Her fingers twitched, as if she might reach for him, but she curled them into a fist instead. "Eternity's a cage," Rin called her. "You burned through it." He stared at her, the cocky grin fading into something real. "Lost my squad to a cage of my own making," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "Been flying solo since, running from ghosts. Guess I crashed into yours instead." He leaned closer, the space between them shrinking, her heat a pull he couldn't resist. Her eyes softened, twin pupils searching his, and for a moment, the expanse was just background noise, glass and drones and danger, fading to a hum. Then a sharp crack split the air, a floating island overhead colliding with another, raining molten shards into the dunes. Zyrra snapped upright, her tail lashing, and Rin grabbed the shard, rolling to his feet. "Break's over," he said, brushing dust from his jacket. "Where to, Shiny?" She pointed to a distant ridge, where the glass dipped into shadow, hinting at caverns below. "The ether vault's near. If we reach it, we might." Her words cut off as a Reaper's beam sliced through the spire beside them, shattering it into a storm of fragments. Rin grabbed her arm, pulling her clear, and they ran, the drones closing in, their red eyes glinting like predators locking on prey. Glass crunched underfoot, the ridge drawing closer, and Rin's mind raced, half on survival, half on the alien beside him, her words echoing in his skull. "Eternity's a cage." He didn't know what she was running from, but he'd be damned if he let Chiron's tin cans catch them before he found out. The Reaper's beams lit the dunes behind, and Zyrra's tail brushed his back, a fleeting anchor as they pushed into the fray. Glass shards sprayed across the dunes as Rin, Blaze, Calder, and Zyrra Velithar sprinted toward the shadowed ridge, the fractured expanse a glittering blur around them. The Reaper drone's beams sliced the air, searing the ground into smoking mirrors, their mechanical whines a relentless howl in the static-charged wind. Rin's boots slipped on the brittle surface, his flight jacket flapping, the singed edges trailing dust. Beside him, Zyrra moved like liquid light, her glossy skin catching the fading glow of Clitheron's twin suns, her dew-damp silk dress clinging to her curves. Narrow waist, wide hips, a bust that shifted with every stride. Her tail lashed behind her, indigo tip glowing, a beacon in the chaos. "Faster!" she barked, her voice cutting through the din, melodic yet edged with steel. A beam grazed her shoulder, singeing the silk, and she stumbled, her amber eyes flashing with fury. Rin grabbed her arm, his fingers sinking into her warm, slick skin, pulling her upright as they dove behind a jagged spire. The glass trembled under the drone's assault, and he pressed close, his chest heaving against her back, her heat a wild pulse that matched his own. "Close one, shiny," he panted, peering around the spire. 3 reapers circled, their red eyes glinting, claw arms extended like vultures ready to strike. "These tin cans don't quit, huh?" He flashed her a grin, shard gripped tight in his fist, but his gray eyes flicked to the ridge, close now, a dark maw in the glass promising shelter. "They won't," Zyrra said, her tail flicking, brushing his thigh with a fleeting sting. "They're programmed to harvest until you're drained or dead." She straightened, dusting glass from her arms, her movements sharp but graceful. "The vault's our only chance." Rin nodded, adrenaline surging, and they broke cover, zigzagging through the dunes. A reaper swooped low, its beams scorching the ground inches from his boots, and he dove, rolling into a shallow trench. Zyrra landed beside him, her body slamming into his with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs. She pinned him down, her knees bracketing his hips, her claws digging into his chest through his jacket, the sharp pressure a jolt that raced through him. Her tail coiled around his waist, tight and unyielding, the glowing tip pressing firm into his lower back with a slow, grinding slide that made his muscles tense and his mind reel. Her glossy curves molded to him, full bust crushing his ribs, silk slipping slick and hot over his skin, and Rin's hands shot to her hips, fingers sinking into the taut flesh beneath the fabric, a desperate anchor in the storm. "Stay still," she hissed, her lips brushing his ear, her breath a crackling spark that burned against his stubbled jaw. Her tail tightened, the pressure a maddening pulse that sent heat flooding through him, raw and overwhelming, teetering on the edge of control. Her amber eyes locked on his, twin pupils dilated, smoldering with a mix of rage and something primal, something that made the air between them thrum with unspoken hunger. "They'll pass if we're quiet." Rin swallowed, his throat dry, forcing a smirk through the haze. "Quiet's not my strong suit, princess," he rasped, voice rough with strain, his hands flexing on her hips, feeling the curve shift under his grip. "But for you, I'll try." Her claws pricked deeper, a sharp tease that danced between pain and thrill, and her tail eased off, sliding slow and deliberate down his spine, leaving a trail of tingling fire in its wake. She shifted, her weight lifting, and the cold rush of air where her heat had been hit him like a punch. "Up," she ordered, rolling to her feet with a grace that belied the chaos, her dress clinging tighter as she brushed glass from her thighs. Rin scrambled up, shard in hand, his pulse still hammering from her touch, and followed her gaze. The reapers circled wider, their beams cutting random arcs through the dunes, buying them a breath. They darted for the ridge, the glass crunching underfoot, the shadowed maw growing larger, a cavern entrance, its edges jagged with crystalline teeth. Rin's legs burned, his jacket snagging on a spire, but Zyrra's tail flicked ahead, guiding him like a lifeline. The air thickened as they neared, a faint hum rising from the depths, vibrating through the ground. "The vault," Zyrra said, slowing as they reached the threshold, her voice tight with something. Anticipation, maybe fear. The ether's heart. Rin peered into the darkness, the hum prickling his skin. "Looks cozy," he quipped, wiping sweat from his brow. "What's the catch?" He stepped closer, the glass giving way to smooth stone, and Zyrra grabbed his wrist, her claws pricking his skin, halting him. "It's sacred," she said, her amber eyes meeting his, twin pupils sharp and searching. "No humans ever entered. The crystals, they're alive, in a way. They'll sense you." Her grip tightened, a warning, but her tail brushed his arm, a softer touch that contradicted her words. "Sense me, huh?" Rin grinned, leaning into her grip. "Guess I'm irresistible." Her tail flicked, smacking his shoulder, but her lips quirked. Almost a smile, quickly buried. Before she could retort, a mechanical screech split the air, and a reaper dropped from the sky, its claw arms slashing toward Rin's back. He spun, shards slashing upward, the metal biting into the drone's limb with a shower of sparks. The reaper recoiled, its red eye flickering, and Zyrra lunged, her claws raking its hull, tearing a gash that spewed blue energy. "Inside," she shouted, shoving Rin toward the cavern, her hand pressing firm into his chest, claws grazing his ribs through the jacket. They stumbled in together, the drone's beams scorching the entrance as they fell, rolling down a slope into the shadows. The world shifted. Darkness swallowed the expanse's glare, replaced by a soft indigo glow from crystalline walls that pulsed like a heartbeat. Rin hit the ground hard, Zyrra landing beside him, her breath ragged. The cavern stretched vast and deep, a labyrinth of glowing tunnels, the air thick with a hum that vibrated in his chest. He pushed himself up, glass dust clinging to his jacket, and offered her a hand. "Nice teamwork, Shiny," he said, his grin returning. "We're 2 for 2. She ignored his hand, rising on her own, but her tail brushed his wrist as she stood, a fleeting anchor. "Don't get cocky," she muttered, dusting off her dress, the silk catching the glow in a way that made her curves stand out sharper. "The Reapers won't follow here. They can't. But Chiron will." Rin flexed his hand, the shards still warm from the fight, and scanned the tunnel. Crystals jutted from the walls, some small as fists, others towering like spires, all pulsing with that eerie light. "So this is the ether vault," he said, stepping closer to a cluster, the hum intensifying. "Feels like it's watching me." "It is," Zyrra said, her voice softer now, laced with something reverent. "The crystals are tied to us, our immortality, our essence. They're weakening, though. Chiron thinks your life force can fix them." She moved beside him, her shoulder brushing his, her heat a steady pulse in the cool air. "He's wrong." Rin turned, catching her gaze, the indigo glow reflecting in her amber eyes. "Wrong how?" he asked, his voice dropping, the cocky edge giving way to something real. "You've been chasing me halfway across this hellscape. Why stick your neck out?" Her tail flicked, hovering near his chest, and she stepped closer, the space between them shrinking to a breath. "Because you're a spark," she said, her words echoing their earlier exchange, but heavier now, weighted with truth. "My kind, we've lived too long, too safe. We've lost the fire. You burn with it." Her claws brushed his jacket, a light touch that sent a shiver through him, and her tail grazed his hip, a whisper of contact that lingered. He swallowed, the hum of the crystals fading to a background buzz. "Fire's all I've got left," he admitted, the words raw, unguarded. "Lost everything else, squad, home, sanity. Crashing here? Maybe it's where I'm supposed to be." He leaned in, their faces inches apart, her heat pulling him like gravity. A distant rumble broke the moment, the cavern trembling as dust sifted from the ceiling. Zyrra's tail snapped back, her eyes darting upward. "They're coming," she said, her voice hardening. "Chiron's forces, more reapers, maybe worse." She grabbed his arm, claws pricking his skin, and pulled him deeper into the tunnel, the glow intensifying with every step. Rin followed, shard in hand, his mind racing, half on the fight ahead, half on the alien beside him, her words searing into his skull. "Fire's all I've got left." The tunnel twisted downward, the hum growing louder, and Zyrra's tail brushed his back again, a steady rhythm as they moved into the heart of the vault, the shadows closing in around them. The ether vault's indigo glow pulsed through the crystalline tunnels, a heartbeat that thrummed in Rin Blaze Calder's chest as he and Zyrra Velithar moved deeper into its labyrinthine depths. The air grew thick, heavy with static and a faint metallic tang, the walls of jagged crystals casting fractured reflections of their shadows. Rin's battered flight jacket and Zyrra's glossy silhouette, her dew-damp silk dress catching the light like a beacon. Her tail flicked ahead, indigo tip glowing, guiding them through the twists of stone and crystal, while the distant rumble of Chiron's forces echoed behind, a storm closing in. "Keep moving," Zyrra said, her voice tight, melodic yet edged with urgency. She gripped his arm, claws pricking through his sleeve, her glossy skin warm against his wrist as she pulled him around a corner. The tunnel widened, the ceiling soaring into a cavernous dome studded with towering crystals, some slender as spears, others broad as ancient trees, all pulsing with unstable light, indigo and gold swirling in chaotic bursts. At the center loomed the ether core, a massive, fractured gem suspended in a web of electric tendrils, its surface cracked and flickering, a dying star on the brink of collapse. Rin slowed, his boots scuffing the smooth stone floor, shards still clutched in his fist. "Holy hell!" he breathed, gray eyes wide as the core's hum vibrated through him, rattling his bones. "That's the big boss, huh? Looks like it's having a bad day." He flashed Zyrra a grin, but it faltered. Her amber eyes, twin pupils sharp, were locked on the gem, her tail lashing with a restless rhythm. "It's the heart of Clitheron," she said, stepping closer, her silver hair spilling over her shoulders, the peony clip glinting faintly. "Our immortality flows from it, but its failing has been for cycles. Chiron thinks your life can mend it." Her voice hardened, claws flexing at her sides. "He's wrong." "Glad we're on the same page, Shiny," Rin quipped, but his gut twisted. The hum intensified, a pressure building in his skull, and he felt it. The core wasn't just alive. It was watching, its energy probing him like a spotlight on a runaway pilot. He shook it off, stepping beside her, their shoulders brushing. "So what's the play? Blow it up and call it a day." Zyrra's tail flicked, smacking his leg with a sting that made him grunt. "Fool," she muttered, but her lips twitched, a flicker of warmth breaking through her steel. "Destroying it kills us all. We need to stabilize it without feeding it you." She moved toward the core, her dress clinging tighter with every step, accentuating her killer curves. Narrow waist, wide hips, a bust that shifted with her breath. And Rin followed, his eyes tracing her form before snapping back to the gem. A sharp clang echoed through the cavern, metal on stone, and the tunnel behind them erupted with motion. Chiron strode in, his silver-veined skin glinting under the glow, his obsidian horns sharper than Zyrra's, flanked by a dozen reapers and a squad of enslaved Clitherons, gaunt figures in tattered robes, their eyes hollow, chains clinking as they shuffled forward. The elder's gaze locked on Rin, cold and unyielding, his voice a low rumble that cut through the hum. "You brought the pest to our sanctum, Zyrra. Fitting he dies here." Zyrra stepped in front of Rin, her tail lashing like a whip, her claws bared. "He's not yours to claim, Chiron," she snapped, her body a taut shield between them. "Your desperation blinds you. This isn't the way." Rin gripped the shard tighter, his grin sharpening into something feral. "Guess I'm the main event, huh?" he said, sidestepping Zyrra to meet Chiron's glare. "Sorry, old man. Don't plan on dying for your shiny rock." The reapers fanned out, their red eyes glinting, clawarms extending with a mechanical screech, and the enslaved Clitherons raised crude spears, their movements jerky, forced. Chiron's lips curled, a sneer that dripped contempt. "Your chaos ends now, human. The ether demands sacrifice, yours or hers." He gestured to Zyrra, and her tail stiffened, her amber eyes flashing with defiance. "Choose, Zyrra, his blood or your immortality." "No," she growled, her voice a blade, and she lunged, claws slashing at the nearest reaper. The drone recoiled, its hull sparking, and Rin dove into the fray, shards slashing upward, carving a gash in another's claw arm. The cavern erupted. Reapers swarmed, beams scorching the stone, and the enslaved Clitherons staggered forward, spears thrusting with lifeless precision. Rin ducked a beam, rolling behind a crystal spire, and sprang up, driving his shard into a Reaper's eye. The drone shrieked, blue energy spewing, and he yanked the metal free, grinning as it collapsed. "One down," he shouted, glancing at Zyrra. She fought like a storm, claws raking hulls, her tail whipping to knock a spear from an enslaved hand, her dress tearing at the hem, but still clinging to her curves, a vision of fury and grace. "Focus, human!" she barked, dodging a beam that shattered a crystal beside her, shards raining down. Rin nodded, adrenaline surging, and tackled another Reaper, wrestling its claw arm until it snapped with a crunch. The enslaved Clitherons closed in, their hollow eyes locked on him, and he parried a spear thrust, kicking one back with a grunt. "These guys need a vacation," he muttered, sweat stinging his eyes. Chiron advanced, his hands glowing with indigo light, the ether's power crackling around him. He thrust a palm forward, and a wave of energy slammed into Rin, hurling him against the spire. Pain flared through his ribs, the shard clattering from his grip, and he slid to the ground, gasping. Zyrra spun, her tail lashing out, but Chiron caught it midair, twisting with a cruel yank that made her cry out, stumbling to her knees. "Enough!" Chiron snarled, dragging her closer, her glossy skin dulling under his grip. "You've defied me too long, Zyrra. His life, or yours?" The core flickered wildly, its cracks widening, the hum rising to a deafening roar. Rin pushed himself up, blood trickling from a cut on his brow, and grabbed the shard, staggering forward. "Let her go, you bastard," he growled, voice raw with fury. He lunged, but a Reaper's claw arm caught his shoulder, slamming him back, pinning him to the stone. The metal dug into his flesh, a sharp ache that made him grit his teeth, and Chiron's sneer widened. "Pathetic," the elders said, releasing Zyrra's tail. She collapsed, her breath ragged, and Chiron turned to the core, raising his hands. "Your vitality will suffice, human, a spark to reignite eternity." The Reapers tightened their grip, dragging Rin toward the gem, its tendrils snapping like hungry tongues. Zyrra's amber eyes met his, twin pupils blazing, and she surged to her feet, shoving past a Reaper to reach him. "No," she shouted, her claws slashing the drone's arm, freeing Rin as he stumbled into her. She caught him, her body pressing flush against his, her arms wrapping around his torso, claws digging into his back with a fierce, desperate grip that sent a jolt through him. Her tail coiled around his waist, tight and possessive, the glowing tip pressing firm into his spine, a slow, grinding pressure that made his breath hitch despite the pain. Her glossy curves crushed against him, full bust sliding slick over his chest, silk warm and taut, and her lips hovered near his, her breath a hot spark that burned against his skin. "We end this together," she gasped, her voice trembling with resolve, her amber eyes locked on his, smoldering with a fire that mirrored his own. Her claws slid higher, pressing into his shoulders, and her tail tightened, the heat of her body a lifeline that drowned out the chaos. Rin's hands found her hips, fingers sinking into the silk, feeling the taut curve beneath, and he nodded, his grin returning, rough and real. "Together it is, shiny," he rasped, his voice thick with strain and something deeper, something that burned brighter than the core itself. Chiron roared, hurling another wave of energy, but Zyrra spun, shielding Rin with her body, the blast grazing her side, singeing her dress. She staggered, her skin paling, and Rin caught her, his arm around her waist, holding her upright as they faced the elder. The Reapers closed in, their beams lighting the cavern, and Chiron's hands glowed brighter, the core's tendrils thrashing wildly. Rin tightened his grip on Zyrra, her heat steadying him, and scanned the chaos. Crystals, drones, the gem's pulsing heart. His pilot's instincts kicked in, searching for a crack, a way to turn this crash into a comeback. "Got a plan?" he murmured, his lips brushing her ear, the hum drowning out all but her. Her tail flicked, grazing his thigh, and she nodded, her voice a whisper against his neck. "The core, it's unstable. We can overload it, force it to reset." She pulled back, her amber eyes fierce, and Rin grinned, shard in hand, ready to burn with her. They broke apart, dodging a reaper's claw, and charged toward the gem, the cavern trembling as Chiron's power surged, the enslaved Clitherons staggering forward, spears raised in the flickering light. The ether vault roared with chaos as Rin, Blaze, Calder, and Zyrra Velithar charged toward the flickering core, its indigo gold light fracturing the cavern in wild bursts. Reaper beams scorched the crystalline walls, carving molten scars, while the enslaved Clitherons staggered forward, their spears thrusting with hollow precision. Rin's shard gleamed in his fist, blood and sweat streaking his stubbled jaw, his flight jacket torn at the shoulder where a claw had grazed him. Beside him, Zyrra moved like a tempest, her glossy skin dulled by dust but still radiant, her dew-damp silk dress clinging to her killer curves. Narrow waist, wide hips, a bust that shifted with every dodge. Her tail lashed, indigo tip glowing, a whip of defiance against the storm. "Keep him off me," Rin shouted, ducking a spear thrust, his boots sliding on the smooth stone. He spun, slashing the shard across an enslaved Clitheron's arm, the figure crumpling with a hollow groan. Zyrra pivoted, her claws raking a reaper's hull, sparks flying as she tore its eye free, blue energy spewing. "On it," she snapped, her voice a melodic growl, her amber eyes flashing with twin pupils that burned through the haze. Chiron loomed near the core, his silver-veined hands glowing with indigo power, the electric tendrils thrashing around the gem like a beast in pain. "You'll die for nothing," he roared, thrusting a palm forward. A wave of energy slammed into the ground, shattering a crystal spire into a rain of shards. Rin dove, rolling clear, but the blast caught Zyrra's leg, sending her crashing to her knees with a sharp cry. Her tail whipped, striking the stone, and Rin lunged back, grabbing her arm, his fingers sinking into her warm, slick skin as he hauled her up. "Stay with me, Shiny," he grunted, his arms sliding around her waist, claws pricking his ribs as she steadied herself against him. Her heat pressed into his side, a lifeline in the chaos, and her tail coiled briefly around his thigh, the glowing tip brushing firm against his muscle with a fleeting jolt that made his breath hitch. "We're too pretty to die here. Speak for yourself," she retorted, her voice rough but edged with a flicker of warmth, her amber eyes meeting his for a heartbeat before she pulled free, claws bared. A reaper swooped low, its claw arm slashing, and Rin tackled her out of its path, their bodies tumbling across the stone in a tangle of limbs. He landed atop her, his hands digging in her hips, fingers sinking into the taut silk as her glossy curves pressed flush against him. Full bust crushing his chest, her tail snapping up to coil tight around his waist, the pressure a slow, grinding pulse that sent heat roaring through him. Her claws raked his back, digging through his jacket with a sharp sting that teetered on the edge of pain and thrill, and her lips parted, her breath a hot spark against his neck that burned through the haze. "Get off, human," she hissed, but her tail tightened, sliding higher, the glowing tip pressing firm in his lower back with a deliberate grind that made his hips twitch, raw and overwhelming. Her amber eyes locked on his, twin pupils dilated, smoldering with fury and a hunger that made the air crackle. Electric, alive, daring him to push further. Rin's hands flexed, tracing the curve of her hips, the silk slick under his palms, and he grinned, rough and reckless. "Thought you liked me on top," he rasped, voice thick with strain, his heart pounding against her chest. Her claws pricked deeper, a tease of danger that sent a shiver down his spine, and her tail eased off, brushing his thigh with a fleeting flick as she shoved him aside. The cold stone hit his back, but the ghost of her heat lingered, a fire he couldn't shake. "Move!" she barked, rolling to her feet, her dress torn at the thigh now, revealing more of her glossy skin as she charged the Reaper, claws slashing its arm clean off. Rin scrambled up, shard in hand, and darted toward the core, dodging a beam that scorched the ground beside him. The gem loomed closer, its cracks widening, tendrils snapping with frantic energy, and he scanned it, pilot instincts kicking in, searching for a weak point, a way to overload it like Zyrra said. Chiron spun, his glowing hands thrusting forward, and another wave of energy slammed into Rin, hurling him against a crystal cluster. Pain flared through his shoulder, the shard clattering away, and he slid to the ground, gasping, blood trickling from his brow. "Persistent bastard," he muttered, pushing himself up, but Chiron advanced, his sneer cold and triumphant. "Your spark ends here," the elder said, raising a hand, the indigo light intensifying. Before he could strike, Zyrra leapt, tackling Chiron with a feral growl, her claws raking his chest, tearing silver veins open. He roared, shoving her back with a blast that sent her crashing into a spire, her body crumpling, her tail twitching against the stone. "Zyrra!" Rin shouted, staggering to his feet, shard forgotten as he ran to her. The Reapers closed in, beams lighting the cavern, and the enslaved Clitherons surged, spears thrusting, but he ignored them, dropping to his knees beside her. She groaned, her amber eyes fluttering open, twin pupils hazy, and he slid an arm under her, pulling her close, her glossy skin warm against his chest, her weight a desperate anchor. "Stay with me," he said, his voice raw, brushing silver hair from her face, his fingers trembling against her cheek. Her tail flicked, coiling weakly around his wrist, the glowing tip pressing soft into his skin, a faint pulse that steadied him. "We're not done yet." Her lips quirked, a ghost of a smile. "Fool," she whispered, her voice faint, her claws grazing his arm as she pushed herself up, leaning into him. The core overloaded. "Now." Her amber eyes burned, fierce despite the pain, and Rin nodded, helping her stand, his arm tight around her waist, her curves molding to his side. "On it," he said, scanning the cavern. The shard lay near a shattered Reaper, and he lunged, snatching it as a beam grazed his shoulder, singeing his jacket. He spun, racing back to the core, Zyrra limping beside him, her tail brushing his leg with every step. Chiron roared, hurling another blast, but Rin dodged, pulling Zyrra down as it shattered a crystal above, shards raining around them. "Got a weak spot?" he asked, breathless, eyeing the gem's fractured surface, tendrils thrashing wildly. Zyrra nodded, pointing to a jagged crack near its base, pulsing with unstable light. "There, hit it hard. I'll amplify it." Her claws flexed, glowing faintly with ether energy, her skin paling as she drew on her fading power. Rin grinned, shard raised. "Time to crash this party," he said, and drove the metal into the crack, striking with all his strength. The core shuddered, a deep groan echoing through the cavern, and Zyrra pressed her hands to the gem beside him, her claws sinking into its surface, indigo light flaring around her fingers. The tendrils spasmed, snapping toward them, and Chiron charged, his glowing hands outstretched, fury twisting his face. "You'll destroy us all," he bellowed, slamming a blast into the stone beside them, the shockwave knocking Rin back. He caught himself, lunging forward again, and struck the crack harder, the shards sinking deeper as Zyrra's power surged, her skin dulling, her breath ragged. The core's hum rose to a scream, the light fracturing into blinding chaos, and the Reapers faltered, their red eyes flickering, the enslaved Clitherons dropping their spears with hollow moans. "Keep going," Zyrra gasped, her voice breaking, her claws slipping as her strength waned. Rin grabbed her wrist, pulling her close, his arm around her shoulders, her heat a fading ember against him. "Together," he said, his voice steady, and struck the core again, the metal biting deep, cracks spiderwebbing outward. Chiron reached them, his hand clamping around Zyrra's throat, yanking her back with a snarl. "Traitor!" he spat, his indigo light flaring, but Rin spun, driving the shard into the elder's arm, tearing through silver veins. Chiron howled, releasing her, and Zyrra stumbled into Rin, her body trembling, her tail coiling weakly around his leg as they faced the core together, its light pulsing wildly, tendrils thrashing in a final frenzy. The cavern shook, crystals shattering from the walls, and Rin tightened his grip on Zyrra, her amber eyes locked on his, twin pupils fading but fierce. They struck the core one last time, shard and claws sinking in unison, and the gem flared, a blinding wave of energy surging outward, washing over the cavern in a roar of light and sound. Dust sifted from the ceiling, the Reapers collapsing mid-flight, and Chiron staggered back, his glow dimming as the enslaved Clitherons sank to their knees, chains clattering against the stone. The ether vault trembled as the core's blinding flare surged outward, a tidal wave of indigo gold light that drowned the cavern in raw, chaotic energy. Rin blazed, Calder clung to Zyrra Velithar, his arm locked around her waist, her glossy body pressed tight against his, a fading ember in the storm. Her claws dug into his shoulders, sharp and desperate, her tail coiling weakly around his leg as the shock wave roared past. Dust and crystal shards rained from the ceiling, the Reapers collapsing mid-flight with screeches of twisting metal, their red eyes flickering out. Chiron staggered back, his silver-veined hands dimming, while the enslaved Clitherons sank to their knees, chains clattering against the stone like a final, broken note. Rin's ears rang, his vision swimming, but he tightened his grip on Zyrra, her heat, duller now, mortal, grounding him. "We did it, Shiny," he rasped, his voice rough with exhaustion, brushing her silver hair from her face. Her amber eyes fluttered, twin pupils hazy but fierce, and her lips parted, a faint breath escaping as she slumped against him, her glossy skin paling under the strain of her fading immortality. "Not yet," she whispered, her voice trembling, her claws sliding down his chest, pricking through his torn flight jacket. The core pulsed behind them, its cracks sealing with a groan, the tendrils slowing, but Chiron's roar cut through the hum, his silhouette rising from the chaos, indigo light flaring anew in his hands. "You'll pay for this," he bellowed, charging forward, his horns glinting like daggers. The elder hurled a blast, the energy arcing toward them, and Rin shoved Zyrra aside, taking the hit square in the chest. Pain exploded through him, hurling him back against the core's base, his shard clattering away as he hit the stone hard, breath knocked from his lungs. "Rin!" Zyrra cried, scrambling to her feet, her tail lashing as she lunged at Chiron. Her claws slashed his arm, tearing silver veins, but he grabbed her throat, lifting her with a snarl, his grip tightening until her breath choked off. Her tail whipped, striking his leg, and Rin staggered up, blood dripping from his brow, his gray eyes blazing with a fire that refused to die. "Let her go, you bastard!" he roared, tackling Chiron with a force that sent them crashing to the ground. The elder's blast fizzled, his hands clawing at Rin, but Rin drove a fist into his jaw, then another, his knuckles splitting against silver skin. Chiron snarled, shoving him off with a surge of energy, and Rin rolled, snatching the shard as he sprang back, shard raised like a pilot locking on target. Zyrra broke free, her claws raking Chiron's chest, and together they struck, Rin's shard sinking into the elder's shoulder, Zyrra's claws tearing through his side. Chiron howled, his glow faltering, and he stumbled back, collapsing against a spire, his breath ragged, silver blood pooling beneath him. "You destroy everything," he gasped, his amber eyes fading, twin pupils shrinking to pinpricks. "Wrong," Rin panted, stepping back, shard dripping in his hand. "We're saving it." He turned to Zyrra, her chest heaving, her dress torn at the thigh and shoulder, her glossy sheen dulled, but her amber eyes burning with life. The core's hum steadied, a low, rhythmic pulse, its light stabilizing, tendrils curling inward like a beast at rest. But the gem wasn't done. A sharp crack split the air, a final fracture bursting open, and a tendril lashed out, snapping toward Rin. Zyrra moved faster, shoving him aside, her body slamming into his as they hit the ground together, rolling across the stone. She landed atop him, her knees bracketing his hips, her claws digging into his chest with a fierce, possessive grip that sent a jolt through him, sharp and electric. Her tail coiled tight around his waist, the glowing tip pressing firm into his lower back, sliding slow and deliberate with a grinding pressure that made his breath catch, heat flooding his veins. Her glossy curves crushed against him, full bust pressing slick and warm through his jacket, silk taut over her narrow waist. And her lips hovered inches from his, her breath a hot spark that burned against his stubbled jaw, wild and alive. "We end this now," she gasped, her voice raw with resolve, her amber eyes locking on his, twin pupils smoldering with a fire that matched his own. Her claws slid higher, pressing into his shoulders, digging through fabric to prick his skin, and her tail tightened, the pressure a maddening pulse that made his hips twitch, raw and overwhelming, teetering on the edge of control. Rin's hands shot to her hips, fingers sinking into the silk, tracing the taut curve beneath, a desperate anchor as the core's tendrils thrashed above. "Together," he growled, his voice thick with strain and something deeper, something that burned brighter than the chaos around them. He surged up, capturing her lips in a fierce, searing kiss, his mouth crashing into hers with a hunger that drowned out the hum. Her lips parted, hot and urgent, her claws raking his back as she pressed herself closer, her tail sliding higher, grinding firm against his spine. The kiss deepened, electric and desperate, her glossy heat molding to him, a collision of sparks that lit every nerve. Intimate, alive, a vow sealed in fire. She pulled back, breathless, and thrust her hands toward the core, her claws glowing with the last of her ether power. Rin followed, slamming the shard into the fracture, their movements synchronized, a final strike that poured their bond into the gem. Zyrra's voice broke as she renounced her immortality. "I choose this." And the core flared, a blinding wave of light surging outward, washing over the cavern in a roar of renewal. Her skin dulled fully, mortal now, and a faint glow pulsed in her abdomen, a spark of new life igniting within her. Their child, conceived in the chaos of their union. The light faded, the core settling into a steady indigo glow, its cracks healed, tendrils curling inward. Chiron's body slumped, lifeless, his silver blood pooling, and the enslaved Clitherons rose, their chains snapping free, eyes clearing as they staggered toward the tunnels, fleeing into the expanse. Rin sank to his knees, Zyrra collapsing into his arms, her head resting against his chest, her tail loosening but lingering around his waist, a soft anchor. "We're alive," he murmured, brushing her hair back, his fingers trembling against her cheek. Her amber eyes met his, twin pupils soft now, mortal and bright, and she smirked, a faint echo of her old sass. "With you?" "Barely," she whispered, her voice hoarse but warm, her claws grazing his arm with a gentle touch. Rin grinned, rough and real, and pulled her closer, her heat a steady pulse against him, the cavern quiet save for the core's hum and their ragged breaths. Days later, the Ember Talon streaked through the void, its sleek hull patched with Clitheron crystal, a jury-rigged fix that held, barely. Rin sat at the controls, his jacket stitched and blood-free, a cigarette dangling unlit from his lips as he steered toward a distant planet. Terrace, a crystalline oasis with mirrored lakes and glass groves, a new start. Zyrra stood beside him, her silk dress traded for a sleek tunic, her glossy sheen gone, but her curves no less striking, her tail flicking with restless energy, the peony clip still pinned in her silver hair. "Think we'll make it?" she asked, leaning against the console, her shoulder brushing his, her amber eyes glinting with a mix of doubt and hope. Her hand rested on her abdomen, the faint glow of their unborn son a quiet promise beneath her fingers. Rin smirked, flipping a switch, the engine's humming smoother now. We've crashed worse, Shiny. This piece of cake. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers, his scarred grip steady against her softer skin. Besides, kid's gonna need a home. Might as well build one. She snorted, her tail smacking his leg, but her smirk softened into a smile. Rare, real, and his. You'll burn it down trying to cook, she said, her voice teasing, and he laughed, the sound filling the cockpit, a spark against the void. Weeks later, on terrace, they stood amid a grove of glass trees, their new home rising from the crystalline soil. A simple structure of mirrored stone and salvaged metal, the ember talon parked nearby. Rin flipped a slab of meat on a makeshift grill, smoke curling into the air under twin auroras, and Zyrra swatted his arm with her tail, her amber eyes rolling as the meat charred. Told you, she said, stepping closer, her curves brushing his side, her hand resting on his shoulder. He grinned, tossing the burnt piece aside, and pulled her into his arms, her tail coiling around his waist as their laughter mingled, echoing over the lakes, a family forged in fire, thriving under alien skies. The auroras danced above, casting prismatic light over the grove, and Rin lit his cigarette, exhaling smoke into the night as Zyrra leaned into him, her warmth a steady rhythm against his heartbeat.